Thank you, Premier Notley. That was an extraordinary review of what you've undertaken in Alberta. And among the many governments that had to shift gears over the past year to make the Paris Agreement come together, none perhaps had more shifting to do than Alberta. So congratulations to what you have done. It really is a remarkable model, not only for Alberta, but for energy producers around the world. I'm going to jump right into it. You heard I'm Dan Esty. We have an incredible panel here to close out our morning discussions, panel discussions. And a number of panelists have interesting and important suggestions to make on our topic, which is to think through the challenges and opportunities of a clean energy transition. And in terms of corporate leadership, Siemens stands right at the front of companies that are trying to make that transition happen. And we're extremely pleased to have Roland with us from Siemens headquarters in Munich. So let's start there. You've recently made an announcement, the company has, about becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And this is an extraordinary commitment, not just for a province or a state, but for a company to make. Yeah. How are you going to do it? And maybe more importantly, why?
Well, I mean, first of all, we announced that before COP21 that we want to be carbon net neutral by 2030. We're going to cut our own footprint by half until 2020. And the why is very simple because, I mean, we are just deploying our own technologies. And we believe, and we can show that it's a business case. So that means if a company with 350,000 people working in 200 countries in the world, having countless of manufacturing sites, if we can do that, others can do that as well. So, and it's a win-win-win. It's good for the business, it's good for the economy, and for the ecology as well. So therefore, we are convinced that this is it's a good case. We show it to our employees, we show it to our customers, also to new employees, engaging, of course, young talents from the outside world. And therefore, we are believing very strong in this program. How we do it, it's a combination of energy efficiency in buildings, in our manufacturing sites. We're investing in decentralized energy systems, cogeneration, and alike. We are buying green power, and we are, of course, working also on our fleet. And this combination makes us really moving fast. Last sentence. The biggest lever, of course, is our products we sell to our customers. Here we're saving per annum 500 million tons, which is roughly half the emission of Germany.
Well, that is an incredible story as well. And both what Alberta is doing and what Siemens is doing represent a dimension of what I think the Paris Agreement of last December unleashed, which was a lot of bottom-up activity as opposed to the past 25 years, in which too much of the discussion was top-down. But having said that, we have one of the leaders of the top-down conversation, Jonathan Pershing from the State Department. And Jonathan and I, 25 years ago, he reminded me today, first helped get this conversation going with the Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992. For too much of that intervening generation, we did not deliver at a pace of change that's really required. The Paris Agreement provides a platform now that looks robust, but as you and I were discussing, it doesn't guarantee implementation. How are we going to get where we need to go in that regard?
So thanks very much, Dan, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think that we've seen a number of examples. The Premier, certainly what's going on in the private sector, speak to them quite explicitly. I am struck in some ways by the shift in the investment world, and I thought it'd be kind of interesting just to look at a couple of statistics. Here's one. Last year, investment in renewable energy was at an all-time high. It was about $330 billion. And that meant more money invested in renewables than was spent on new fossil fuel. This is the first time we've seemed to have passed that tipping point. And to me, this is a hallmark of things that are happening at the political level, at all parts of the political level. And I would put into that same context commitments in Paris. If we look at who's made the commitments, the United States has got a commitment on the table, which people are aware of. Canada has one which is now in the process of evaluating the new government. But other major players are out there as well. China's got a commitment which is really quite startling. If you think of the target it set out for in 2020, it's a target of 100 gigawatts, and at the moment they only have 30. If you think about where India is, it's got 100 gigawatts, and just this past year it added 12. These kinds of numbers are extraordinary in the context of the level of change we might see. And then just to conclude with this, I'm also struck about the finance community and what kind of investments are made there. For example, we've got new green bonds and a number of companies in this room working on those at a huge scale, hundreds of billions of dollars of new green bond investment. We've got new commitments coming out of the Financial Stability Board. That's shifting the way we evaluate and assess risk attached to investment. I think that's going to change the nature of the business community's programs. We heard from Lisa Jackson just a moment ago what Apple was doing. We've got a whole host of players at the table here who are really moving this forward. I think the market has shifted in an appreciable way. And in many ways, Paris is the turning point. Morocco, Marrakesh, the next set of sessions will mark the first step in this new world of an implementation agenda instead of a negotiation agenda.
Jonathan, thank you. Let's move to Jonathan number 2. Jonathan, you're with SolarCity, and if any company represents the clean energy transition in America, it might be SolarCity. And I always like to say it's been a company with great innovation, but not only in terms of the technology it puts on people's roofs and the solar cells it deploys, but the finance products that it brings to bear as well. So you're right there in this challenging moment of transition. What is it going to take to get us where we need to go?
We have to give the customers what they want. I mean, we're focused on, our mission is to advance sustainable energy, to massively increase the adoption of sustainable energy. And we can make solar less expensive than utility power in about 19 states today. We see adoption there. Cost was the major barrier that we saw 10 years ago. And now we're incrementally trying to tear down other barriers. It's been a product for single-family homeowners primarily. We know that millennials are probably more passionate about sustainability and the environment than any group in America. We don't have a great product for them. We've introduced our first in Minnesota, a community solar program. And there's community solar, solar essentially for renters, where you can build the solar in a centralized location and give customers access through the utility. And so we're just focused on tearing down more of those barriers. I saw Bill Clinton speak to the solar industry a few years ago, and he said something very salient. He said, "You guys like to preach to the saved. You know how to market to each other." And while climate is politicized and people are split over the cause of climate change and exactly what to do about it, clean energy is extremely popular. 9 out of 10 Americans believe it's very important to the future. It's the most popular source of energy. And if you can find the way to communicate with the consumer, and whether the consumer is a consumer or a voter, I think we'll find that adoption will increase dramatically. And we're trying to do that. In Texas, our loan product has been able to open up that solar to a whole new group of consumers that they'll tell us, frankly, I'm not that concerned about the environment, but I want to save money, and I don't want anybody to tell me that I can't produce my own power, right? In the drought-stricken West, it doesn't require a single drop of water to produce electricity from solar panels, and we've had tremendous success marketing solar through water conservation. So.
I want to come back to you and to Roland in a minute and think about what it takes to ramp up these efforts. But first, I want to ask the Premier a follow-up question, if I can. Having been in government, I know how much pressure there is, not only to do the right thing environmentally, but to drive economic growth. And that's the ultimate challenge for anyone who's a premier or a governor or in any executive position. How are you going to make that happen in the context of this cap that you've committed to, an absolute cap on emissions, which in effect, I think, caps the pace at which the oil sands can be tapped?
Well, what we're really doing is we're sort of placing a marker, and we're putting a marker down on the opportunity of technology and innovation. And we are doing that in 2 ways. First of all, through the establishment of the carbon levy, we will, as a government, be able to incent and support technological investment on the part of the industry itself as they move forward. But obviously, certainty is something that business always likes. I mean, it's not about necessarily incentives or tax breaks as often as it is just a clear set of rules. And by putting that cap in place, there is certainty. And so the investment starts to be developed with that in mind. That being said, the other piece that we're doing is, because there's room still in that, is that we've set up an oil sands advisory group to work collaboratively with business, with communities, with Indigenous people, with environmental groups, to come up with a rational plan for how we allocate the remainder of space underneath that cap. So we'll continue to work in a very collaborative way, in the same way we first established the plan when we introduced it last fall. So I think that's what you do, is that, you know, you use certainty, you provide incentives where they'll help, and you ensure open, transparent, balanced policy making with the stakeholders, where you bring people to the table who might otherwise be opposing, and find those common solutions, understanding that government's backstopping it in a way with the legislative plan. And so that drives people to the table much faster than they might have been otherwise.
Thank you. And Roland, can I pick up on the Premier's comments and ask you a similar question, which is, what is the policy framework that you as a corporate leader would be looking for to help you succeed on not only Siemens' own ambitions, but to be a real solutions provider to the world beyond?
Well, I think it's rather simple. Number one, it needs to be a stable one, so a predictable one for a long term, above and beyond the tenure of our government. So that means we're talking 30, 40 years or longer. And secondly, we believe it should be technology neutral. So we really talk about carbon pricing, carbon tax, and that's it. Because once you do that, and we do believe that carbon emissions does have a price, once you do that right, then you bring immediately, if, for example, in Germany, you would bring gas into the money, and you go down with coal, you would immediately bring the payback for investments in energy efficiency for buildings, for example, down from 5 years to 4 or 3 or even 2 years, and then off you go. So therefore, it sounds rather simple, and maybe you can say some word, why isn't it so simple? But once you do that, I think then we have this tipping point, and we will see a strong development. And we have to not forget that it's not only energy generation, so electricity. It's also about efficiency, how we use energy, and it cuts across all our business. So it's transport and industry is affected. And so with one simple lever, you can have a leverage on all of these industries.
So you've now put on the table, as did the Premier, and frankly, so did Lisa Jackson and Secretary Moniz earlier, the idea that a carbon price would be very helpful. So Jonathan, without putting you on the spot, is there an emerging consensus among the thoughtful folks out there in the world that this is the best practice for how to really drive innovation and implementation of our Paris commitments?
So I would note that there are a lot of countries in the world and a lot of subnational entities in the world that have opted for price structures, either in the form of a cap and trade program or in the form of a tax policy. I would also note that there are a series of barriers to those that play out, and I would argue even more that there are a series of places that may not work, which is not to say in a broad brush those are not going to be central. I think that they will be. Certainly our administration tried to do those. We haven't had political success in making that happen, but I think it'll come back around. It's a very sensible policy. But it probably doesn't drive things in which the rents don't accrue nicely. It doesn't really drive innovation in the R&D space very well. It doesn't look at kind of some of the longer term frameworks, and they may not be the same as a series of incremental short-term changes. But at the same time, I'm struck by the number of countries that are making these kinds of experiments. You're probably aware of the Chinese model working now at a subnational level, hoping to scale it up to a national program on price for cap and trade programs. You may not be aware that India actually has a tax on coal. Not that many people are aware of the fact that it's been done, probably low level still, but I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with people in India, and this is when they're hoping to continue with and really scale up. The Prime Minister there thinks this is a huge problem and part of the solution. And it plays out in pretty much every sector in most economies. But it does run headlong into the questions of political risk and the cost that you have to bear. And that is one that we have not yet successfully managed to overcome. I would make two final observations then in characterizing how that change works. The first is that I'm not of the view that you need to have a policy or a tax in place in order to act if you're in the private sector. I am struck by the overwhelming evidence of the science, and therefore the plausibility of a continued and incrementally increasing stringent domestic policy environment. There is no model in which I have yet seen in which we fix the problem in a year or 10 years or frankly in 30 years, which means we do have a long-term sustained need for change and for decarbonization. And I believe that offers a level of certainty to the private sector. The second thing is that I think that the private sector does well, and we have seen it do well, in uncertainty. That's one of the things that our private sector is remarkably robust at doing. It doesn't mean that all the same companies will be here in 20 years. In fact, if you look at the US Dow or the stock exchange and the major players in 1970 and the major players today, there are a lot of new players. But the market as a whole is remarkably robust. The market as a whole is remarkably innovative and inventive. And to me, we have set the stage with the articulation of the scale of the problem, the IPCC, the Paris Agreement, the agreements in individual nations, which I would argue give you collectively exactly the right template for where you need to be. And now the question is, how do you do it effectively?
Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan, what does SolarCity want from the policy framework to really scale your efforts, which you're already doing, but we all know you've got to go much bigger, much broader, hit new markets? What would be the key elements of that framework from your point of view?
As much certainty as possible at the local level. So there's tremendous progress, obviously, Paris at the international level, at the federal level with the extension of the ITC, but single markets, individual markets at the state level can hinge on support for something like net metering, for example, fair compensation for the solar electricity that the customer puts back on the grid. And when one market reverses itself, as we saw in Nevada over the past year, it can send a chill over other markets. Consumers really want solar. They understand the value proposition. Once they're aware of that there's a way for them to adopt it and save money at the same time, they get very excited. But when they see that a utility commission could take that ability away down the road, it makes them a little reticent. So certainty at the state level is really key for us.
Well, I think one of the things that's turned out to be interesting is that energy policy historically was seen as a national government element. But today it turns out a lot of that energy policy is being set by public utility commissions at that state or provincial level. So that is going to be an interesting place for the implementation unfolding. One of the stories coming out of Paris, and I'm now looking to the government side of the panel here, is how important the role of the private sector is going to be. A second story, Jonathan, that you mentioned is finance and how much robust capital deployment is moving towards clean energy. But I want to ask you a question about the limits of leaving it to the private sector. And Premier, I'll invite you to comment, or Jonathan. But there was discussion earlier of the huge flow of green bond money into some of the investments that are required. I worry, sitting back watching from a distance in the academic world, that there is not a tight framework around what it takes to be a green bond. This is almost self-declared. And isn't that a worry that people are going to do things that are not very green at all? And if we're going to make private capital and things like green bonds central to our conversation about the way we're flowing money to the things that need to be done, don't we need some structure around that? Maybe I'll let Jonathan answer first, and I'll come to you, Premier.
So I'm struck by several things in this debate, and Dan, I think you've really nailed the distinction that people are drawing. Do you seek to have a very open market, as inclusive as possible, but with more modest standards that brings a lot of things in? Over time it iterates, it becomes more robust. Or do you start with a more stringent framework seeking to drive the highest possible standard at the outset and make that quite real? To me, I'd come at it from the other side entirely. I'm struck by the fact that green bonds are mostly being used to invest in things like resilience. And at the moment, I'm struck by how much easier it is to get the private sector to invest in the mitigation technologies than it is to get the private sector to invest in the resilience and climate impact technologies. Those are things, for example, like port facilities. Those are questions for how you harden against sea level rise. Those are issues of how you manage forest fires. It's a huge question as we look into the northwest of this continent. Those are questions that have to do with drought and drought tolerance and resistance. And those are ones that are often backed by government monies paid back in terms of bond markets, which then come into the private sector. And so there the question is, it may be all of the above. It may be that we need some leading edge players. BlackRock's doing some extraordinary work. Allison's got some really incredible ideas here. But we may also need a much larger scope for investment and engagement until we pass some of those tipping points and thresholds. So I'm at the moment of the view that they're probably both relevant strategies. I do think over time we will probably converge on more stringency. I think over time, the American consumer, for example, is not going to find all things equally green, and he or she is likely to take a different policy choice by way of purchasing. I think that's going to play out for governments. I think that's going to play out in bank investments. We're not quite there yet, but I see this as a trajectory that likely is coming.
Thank you. Premier, you come from the progressive side of the political spectrum. You dislodged a conservative party that had been in power for 44 years. Are you worried that we might go too far in thinking the private sector is going to do the job we need done?
Well, I mean, I think it's really important to understand that you need to work with the private sector. I think that there's a failure in not working with the private sector. There's a failure in not understanding the implications of what you're doing on the private sector, because we're making this big thing at the very time that our economy, which is very energy dependent, is dealing with an unprecedented drop in oil prices. So we are very conscious of the need to maintain some form of balance and the ability to work with the private sector, but at the same time, you know, it's potentially an opportunity because people's framing is changing quite dramatically right now anyway as a result of the drop in the price of oil, and innovation is the watchword now for everybody in the private sector. So then the question becomes, can government drive the direction of that innovation in a certain way? And so I think that's where we do have a role to play in terms of setting standards and setting out certain stringencies. Like, for instance, this is not oil and gas related, well, it's a bit gas related, but, you know, in terms of saying the coal phase out and being very clear, this is what's going to happen. And so then, you know, the question becomes is where does innovation and where does investment follow behind that decision? And and in some cases, there's absolutely government must work hand in hand. But for years, and I will say this, I mean, you say it's a conservative government that I dislodged, and that was true, not I, my party as a whole, and the voters of Alberta. But what was interesting was that there were a lot of really progressive voices within what was perceived by many to be sort of the traditional oil and gas sector, saying, listen, we need leadership from government. We know we can do better, but it's not going to happen if there isn't leadership from government. And so I think it's a collective effort.
Dan, let me add on that.
Please.
I believe where it really comes nicely together. You were mentioning the local situation and getting the government and the private sector together. I think where it nicely comes together is the city. Mm-hmm. Most of the cities we are talking to, they do have a CO2 reduction target. By the way, it goes along with also a local emission reduction target, because many cities really suffer from local emissions. So and people want to live in a clean place and in a place where they really can tie into. So, and here you have a local decision body, you have a clear vision. I mean, many cities have already expressed their CO2 reduction or CO2 neutral ambitions. Like Adelaide, we make a study for Adelaide. They want to be also carbon neutral. And then it comes together because it's really about the people. The people are engaging, they're much closer because that's where they are living. The city comes, they have a clear target and they want to deliver on that. By the way, 2/3 of the energy CO2 emissions anyhow come from cities, so it's a good place to fight. And if you then have the right technology partner, and this cuts across all the industries, and we have to tear down silos. So energy and transport, they should be viewed separately from each other. They are now entangling more and more. The more we go for electric driving, for example, you see that as an example. And then you really can make a very good plan for a city. And the good news again is CO2 reduction plus a business case is coming together. Because in many cases it really pays off and it makes a better place for living.
I was going to say quality of life is the third part of that. So you mentioned Adelaide. One of the things that I think we've also come to realize in the Paris discussion, particularly the run-up to Paris, helped us focus on best practices, on where governments were really stepping up and working with the private sector, where solutions were being brought in. You mentioned Adelaide. I have always been impressed by Mayor Frank Jensen of Copenhagen and how much he's doing. Are there any other kind of best practice models you would highlight out there?
Munich is another place. I mean, all the private households, they're already buying CO2 neutral power, for example.
So, Jonathan, anything you want to highlight of critical good policy frameworks?
The state of New York and the work that they're doing around grid services and encouraging, because I think it's really key. Another customer is the utility, so you have to create an incentive for the utility to participate.
Well, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier. The key may be reframing the business model of those power generators and transmission and distribution companies.
Yes, there's tremendous benefit to distributed solar, particularly when packaged with storage. It provides voltage regulation and backup power and a lot of services that utilities really value. So it's creating policies that allow them to unlock that value and don't put the two groups at odds.
You want to name a favorite model out there? I mean, you scan the world, you've been around, you highlighted a couple, what India's doing, what China's doing, any others you want to give us a focus on?
So I actually had a very interesting trip a couple of weeks ago, and one of the stops I made was in South Africa, and met with an NGO that was working with the 5 largest cities in South Africa. And I'm not convinced that one of them was better than the other, but I'm struck by the fact that they were working in 5, and that the kinds of problems were so similar in each of those cities. They were worried about congestion in transport. They were worried about buildings. They were worried about providing energy, and they were worried about waste. And that conversation was Pretoria and Johannesburg, it was Durban, it was Cape Town, and the same thing applied in Mumbai, and the same thing applied in Delhi, and the same thing applied in Hangzhou and in cities like Beijing, and the same thing applies in Dakar and Senegal. So I'm struck that this conversation about urbanization and its development is going to be central, but it also opens up unbelievable new opportunity. And that was what was part of interest to me in this South African model, because they had coordinated not just with the cities, but with the private sector actors in the cities. And here was this really interesting juxtaposition of a civil society group working with the private sector combined with local government. And I think that really offers a window of what we should appreciate.
And Premier, you've already told us Alberta's on the list, so we thank you for highlighting a number of best practices that I think U.S. states will want to look at, and it really does represent a changed dynamic where the leadership is coming from city scale, state scale, province scale, corporate scale. And with that, I have to say thank you all for being part of this panel. We do have to come to a close, and please join me in thanking our panelists.